I'm excited to present to you bonus episode 10 for GMOs Revealed. I'm your host, Dr. Patrick Gentempo, and we have a great slate of people for this bonus episode. We start with Christian Krupke, who is an associate professor at Purdue, who has some very interesting things to tell you about relative to his area of expertise and how it relates to pesticides and the impacts that GMOs and what's sprayed upon them is having on our environment and on our world. Next, we interview Dr. Les Berenson. Dr. Berenson is a medical doctor who has looked at the relationship between glyphosate and the rise of certain diseases in our culture, and I think you'll be fascinated and quite frankly somewhat disturbed by what his findings are. Then we have Dr. Alex Liu, who's an associate professor at Harvard School of Public Health, and he has looked at the impact of glyphosate on colony collapse in the bees. And I don't know if you've been watching TV over the last several years, but there's been many specials on this, and the reverberations and the impact of colony collapse is significant and threatens humanity, something we need to know and understand, and another reason why we need to end this madness called GMOs and what's sprayed upon them. Lastly, we have one of the greatest agents for change in the world of natural health, Dr. Joe Mercola. I have known Joe Mercola for many years, and Mercola.com has had a reverberating impact on the world. It's taken very strong stands on many issues. And if there's anybody who understands the impact of GMOs on the world and on your health and solutions to that, it is Dr. Joe Mercola. So you're going to really enjoy what he has to say. So enjoy this bonus episode. There's a lot of terrific information in here, and I'll see you on the other side.
Christian, I've read a very interesting article that you had written, and I'd like to first have you start off by telling me who you are exactly at Purdue, what you do, what your research entails, and what your actual field of study is.
Okay. I'm an associate professor of entomology here at Purdue, and my specific area that I work with is corn and soybean insect pests. And that area of study led me into this story that you're referring to, which is some of the unintended consequences of managing those pests, and those unintended consequences were honeybee deaths in the spring linked with corn planting.
And corn planting, conventional corn planting, or organic corn planting? I mean, what type of corn planting?
So this was the planting of corn seeds that are not organic. So all of our corn seed that is not organic is treated with several pesticides, including fungicides and insecticides. And the insecticides are in the neonicotinoid class. And that was what was causing the deaths of these bees. So if you think about the 95+ million acres of corn in the United States, all of those acres, virtually all of those acres, except less than 0.5% that are organic, all the rest of those acres would be treated with that cocktail of pesticides. Even
the GMO corn?
Yes.
So I thought the whole point of the GMO corn was that it didn't need to be sprayed with everything, just the glyphosate. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Right. So the GMO corn that is marketed for the control of insects is also called BT corn. And there are two main groups of insects that you're targeting there. One is the moths that start out as caterpillars and feed on the ear itself and on the stalk of the corn. And the other one are beetles called rootworms that feed, of course, on the roots. So you've got BT that targets both of those and is effective at managing them. The neonicotinoids, the insecticides on the seed, don't cover those groups. So they're marketed for everything else, other insects that feed below the ground, on the roots of the plants, and so forth.
And what they're covered in the neonicotinoids, which have only been used fairly recently, right? I mean, in a large scale, just since the mid-2000s.
That's right, approximately a decade or so, a little bit more, or about a decade, yeah, it would be fair to say.
Which is really when we started seeing the colony collapse disorder, or the disappearing of bees on a large scale.
Well,
on a large scale.
Right, and the colony collapse disorder is a tricky thing, because once it was defined, we could name these differences in these hive abandonments. So it may well have been going on before that, but it wasn't named, and it wasn't, people didn't know what to look for and what to call it. They would just call it, oh, well, those bees didn't overwinter well. So tying cause and effect of colony collapse disorder with any event, including these neonicotinoids, is difficult because we weren't looking before, and we didn't have a name for it before.
But your research has shown that the addition of the neonicotinoids has certainly contributed to the large disappearance of bees that we're seeing right now.
What our research shows, and focuses specifically on, is the spring bee kills. And this is, you have large, visible deaths of bees outside of colonies. So you have carpets of dead bees outside the colony in the spring, which is when the colony should be doing the best. So this is a little bit different than hive abandonment, which happens usually in the colder months leading up to spring. So this is covering, okay, why do we have bees dying in April and May?
And what happens if all the bees die?
If all the bees die everywhere?
Yes.
Well, then we have big problems, not the least of which is many of our main food sources of nuts, berries, fruits, vegetables require honeybees or some other insect pollinator, and honeybees are by far the major one. They're the only one we have in wide scale domestic stocks. They're the one that we know how to manage and move. For example, the almond pollination event is the largest pollination event in the world. Many, many thousands of hives. So without honeybees, there's really no second line of how we get these plants pollinated. There has to be an insect that visits these flowers to get a fruit or a nut or vegetable to set.
So are you saying that if all the bees disappeared, you know, again, it's not going to happen overnight, but they're dying in record numbers, that we would actually see increased hunger, or at least increased hunger for produce? I mean, I don't know what else would be left for us to eat.
Yeah, well, you would have a deficit of produce, of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and so on. In the short term, the costs would go up. In the long term, yeah, some of those things may not be available. Without honeybees, there's no question that we would have an altered choice of menu options.
So that poses another question that you may or may not be able to answer. It's not quite your field, however. If the bees are being poisoned, right, there's some toxin from everything we're spraying or soaking the seeds in. Do you think there's one, bioaccumulation in terms of in the bees, in the things that would eat bees, or does it mirror what's going on in the bees? Do you think that mirrors what's going on in other animals, perhaps even humankind? So if it's toxic for the bees' system, biosystem, do you think it's toxic for other animals, other species' biosystems?
Well, in the case of these particular group of insecticides, neonicotinoids, are they toxic for other systems? And certainly they're toxic for many other insects, other invertebrates, things that live in the water, things like earthworms and so on. So that is known that toxicity is there. As far as humans go, this group of insecticides, one of the main reasons that it became so ubiquitous so quickly is that it was safer for mammals and less mammalian toxicity than its predecessors.
However, it works on the nicotinoid receptors,
That's right.
which means it works on the central nervous system.
That's right.
And we have nicotinoid receptors, and usually our acetylcholine works along with those receptors, and that's a huge part of our thought process. I mean, acetylcholine, we couldn't think clearly without acetylcholine. We wouldn't move clearly. You know, we wouldn't move effectively without acetylcholine. All our muscles rely on it. So I know it was thought to be safer, but I mean, and again, you study insects and not mammals, but for somebody who has been trained in mammalian health, specifically human health, it doesn't make sense that while there might be safer, it seems like the accumulation of something that interferes with acetylcholine would be quite damaging.
Neonicotinoids have qualities that make them good insecticides. One of them is that they're water soluble. So they move with the water up into the plant. So you can coat a seed, and at least part of that material goes with the water into the growing plant. But much of it does not, and it goes with water elsewhere. It does not bind to soil very well, so where does it go? It follows where the water goes. It can go to the surface waters, it can be found in the surface waters, groundwater, and so on. So this is a characteristic that makes it a good pesticide. It also makes it hard to deal with when it's not in the plant and on the plant anymore, because water, of course, doesn't stay in the field where the rain happens to fall. It can move sometimes in ways that are counterintuitive.
And have water areas, waterways or water reservoirs been tested that are somewhat far from where the last neonicotinoids had been placed? You know, are we finding their presence in water that's a distance from where they're being used?
In some cases, and the best data that I know of on that front come from Canada, where they've been testing at various distances from where the treatment was applied. But I can't give you a maximum distance of how far that was. I don't know.
But it's being found in the groundwater?
Yeah, it's being found in water that is near agricultural fields at varying rates. And in hindsight, it's not surprising because it is water soluble. And to expect it all to go up into the plant, which is exactly where we want it, and to only kill pests is unreasonable. That's not the way the physics of these compounds works.
And I'm assuming that this is being found in water that makes its way into drinking water for people, or drinking water for animals.
That I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Is it easily filtered? Is it, you know, how can you extract it from drinking water?
These are small molecules, which is part of why they're water soluble. So filtering them might pose some technical difficulties, but I don't know how easy or hard it would be to filter them, and I don't know how much you would need to filter them. Actually, what would be the acceptable level? And I know those levels are published, but I don't know offhand what they are.
But how do we know? Like, how are these acceptable levels even created? Who comes up with what's the acceptable level of a neonicotinoid when we don't even know the risk on animals and on people?
How you register a compound as far as mammalian toxicity goes, that's a whole universe that I'm not all that familiar with. I mean, of course, you know that rats are the species that they usually use, but how they fill the risk cup, as they call it at the EPA, I don't know the answer to that.
Well, what about the combination? Then let's stick with the bees, because that is a territory you're really comfortable with. When you look at things that are affecting bees, and you look at things individually in the lab, they might affect bees a certain way, but when you mix them all together, do they affect bees differently? So my question really pertains to, can I extrapolate that to animals and people? You know, maybe this insecticide by itself isn't too bad, it's a little bad, but not too bad. But when you mix it with a fungicide and an herbicide and maybe something else, are we getting a cocktail of something that has some synergistic effect? You know,
well, yeah, certainly we know that when we mix toxins in many systems, the results are more negative than the additive effects would be expected to be. So there are synergies, and that happens all the time with pesticides as well. In the past, the work with the bees has been focused on why are the bees disappearing? What is the cause of CCD? But now we know it's not that simple. There isn't a cause. There isn't, if we do this, then everything will turn around. What it appears to be is there's a laundry list of causes that includes pesticides, that includes pathogens, varroa mites. But the number one cause depends on where you live. So if you live in an area where there's an intensive pesticide use, intensive neonicotinoid use, for example, then that would be at the top of the list of stressors for those bees. But it's certainly not the only one, because now you layer varroa mites on top and pathogens on top. Well, if these bees are drinking from puddles that have neonicotinoids in them and eating pollen that has low levels of neonicotinoids in them, it's reasonable to expect that they would be more susceptible to pathogens, and there's been work that has shown that that is the case.
So that was my next question, which is, if all these things render the bee more susceptible to pathogens that they've evolved with, right? I mean, they've always evolved with varroa mites. I mean, they're not new. So could you, and again, it's not your field, but do you think we could extrapolate that to people eating produce that now have herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, genetically modified organisms? So there's this whole cocktail now, and people become more, we know that disease is on its way up. It's an exponential climb for autoimmune disease, things like Alzheimer's, cognitive problems, autism. There's just so many diseases that are climbing exponentially, and I forgot to mention breast cancer, cancer in general, but breast cancer specifically. Could it be that it is now making, you know, humankind more susceptible to disease, just like it makes the bees more susceptible to disease?
I don't know of any research that would draw that link. And the biggest problem is, what is the exposure? What is the control group, in other words? That is people that are not being exposed to any pesticides. I don't know that there is such a group of people. So to try to draw these linkages, there's so many confounding factors that I don't even know where you would begin to do such an experiment. It's very difficult to get cause and effect data for what you're talking about, where you have this background, this cornucopia of pesticides. Most of them are at rates that we have no reason to think would be harmful. But what if you have 17 of them at these low rates? What happens then? I don't know.
It sounds like there's a lot of we don't know, right? And which brings me to the question of the concept of the precautionary principle. And I know other countries do things a little differently. In Europe, they tend to respect the precautionary principle a little bit more than we do. Maybe not a whole lot more, but certainly it is something that they at least say, that's a mission in the European Union. Do you feel that going forward, we should be looking at things differently? Should we be releasing pesticides and herbicides and fungicides differently? Should we be looking at them more closely? Should we be using or honoring the precautionary principle in terms of unleashing things on animal kind, plant kind, and mankind in terms of, what you said was, well, it's in 10 years, nobody really knows what's going to happen in 10 years. And at that point, it's in our water, and maybe at that point, it's in all our water. Do you think going forward, is the scientific community talking about honoring the precautionary principle and looking back and going, wow, maybe we need to do things differently?
Well, definitely, yeah. The precautionary principle is in line with how most science is done and how most scientists think. You try to be very conservative in your recommendations and try to ensure that before you make a conclusion, this is safe or this is not safe, that you have statistically, that you have the data to back up those statements. So in the case of the precautionary principle in registering pesticides, some of that has started to happen in terms of the honeybees, because the honeybees have been so well covered and their numbers have been declining. So what the EPA has done is revisit how they assess pesticides before releasing them into the environment in terms of honeybee health. So looking a little bit more closely at different types of studies, more rigorous studies and so forth. But when you have a pesticide that is registered on hundreds of millions of acres, it's hard to close the door after the horse has left the barn kind of thing. So that's the spot that we get into when we don't apply a more rigorous precautionary principle. And one of the main reasons we don't is because there's a strong demand, a strong push to grow more food.
Are we seeing more food grown with neonicotinoids or the creation of GMO, or is this really a push to sell more neonicotinoids and to get money funneled into the GMO, into the industry, the very industry that's creating them? I mean, is it really to improve mankind's yield of food, or is it to make money? I mean, how does the industry play into this?
Well, when you mix together the GMO and neonicotinoid, it's a thing people commonly do, but they are separate and distinct. So the GMO crops have documented efficacy. They do work on significant, important pests. So they're filling a void. The neonicotinoids are quite different. We've had a hard time documenting benefits in terms of yield, in terms of production, in terms of even just the dollar, the economic benefit. We've looked in soybeans, we've looked in corn, we've looked across multiple states as well. The benefits are hard to find, and we've not been able to consistently measure them. So people have asked, well, if neonicotinoids were restricted or eliminated in field crops, and that includes, your corn and soybeans and wheat and so on, what would happen if there was a restriction? And from our research and the data that I've seen, it wouldn't miss a beat in terms of yield and so on. So from the scientific efficacy point of view, the yield point of view, I have not seen data to support that we need to treat all these seeds, but yet that's what we're doing.
So it sounds like this is, in this example, the push to sell neonicotinoids, even though they have this outcome they're adding to the disappearance of the bees, it really doesn't improve any yield. So it's really just a push to sell product.
Well, it's based on a very simple premise of an insurance-based mindset. So these insects may be there 1 out of 10 years, 1 out of 100 years, 1 out of 1,000 fields. And it's marketed as insurance against these outcomes. It's marketed as something inexpensive, easy, that can be put out there and guard against these things that usually won't happen. So the question becomes, is that worth some of the non-target effects, some of the unanticipated negative effects? And it looks like it may not be, because we can't get these benefits, these yields. But in defense of the people that are planting these seeds, farmers and producers, they don't know. This information is just now coming to light. The premise has been this material will work. This is a good product. This is a product that will be beneficial to yields. That's been the premise. The premise has gone largely unchallenged for a long time.
So in theory, these insects that could occur 1 in 100 years, 1 in 1,000 fields, what are these insects and who is telling them this?
What the insects are, they include mostly insects that feed on the root and on the seed. And so this is the early days after the seed hits the ground in April or May. You have insects like wireworms, seed corn maggots, white grubs, and again, these are usually little grub-like or caterpillar or maggot-like insects that live in the soil so you can't see them. So they might be there. There's no way to see unless you dig them up. There's no really good and easy way to monitor for them. And so that creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates fear, and then fear leads to this prophylactic application of pesticides. And that's been the approach that's dominated the Midwest in terms of these particular pesticides on our large acreage crops.
So this is just fear that happens naturally in the farmers, or was there a marketing of this fear?
Well, a lot of our pesticides, all of our pesticides are based on guarding against every contingency that could affect yield. And as crop prices go up, and crop prices are unprecedented highs in the last 2 years, it becomes more and more attractive to use an insurance-based mindset for whatever it is, pest management of insects, fungi, whatever, you name it. So, and the crop value has gone up. And so insecticides are cheap. They're cheaper than they've ever been relative to crop value. And that's a lot of what's driving their adoption. In addition to fear of unknown insects and pests and so on, the fact that it represents a small part of your overall cost of doing business has a role to play as well.
Who pays for the untoward effect of the use of all these chemicals? I mean, do the farmers who are using them for the cheap insurance policies pay? Does the chemical industry pay for this? Or will it be you and I and everyone else paying for the untoward effects when if the bees colonies really decline at the rate they're declining, crop prices will go up. Mm-hmm. Who's going to pay for that?
Well, in the case of the bees, and you lose bees, the first person that pays is the beekeeper to get more beehives. Then a beekeeper can or cannot continue to pay. Sometimes they go out of business. And then after that, the consumer pays in the form of increased crop prices. That's the short-term legacy of fewer honeybees, would be increased prices for certain commodities.
And I'm assuming there's a cost for having chemicals in our water, whether it's a health cost, whether it's a cost in terms of cleaning, water treatment, because I know that the water departments in the cities test for chemicals, and every year there's more chemicals, and they have to find ways to get some of these chemicals out if they're shown to be deleterious to human health. My question is, who's paying for this cheap insurance? Where are the costs really going? Is this really a free market? Is this really, this cheap insurance policy, is it really cheap insurance policy? Who's ultimately paying for it?
Well, in the past, we've seen that these cheap insurance policies generally wind up being expensive. And that can take many forms. One of them is resistance to a pesticide, and then you have to pull that pesticide away and perhaps replace it with something that's not as friendly, cheap, whatever the positive aspects of the first pesticide were. And the other thing, the other cost that you're getting at is a monetary cost, and who bears that cost of environmental cleanups and so on. And those are generally borne by the people that are doing the cleaning up.
So you and me?
Potentially, yeah.
So going forward, researchers are really thinking about the precautionary principle, but what does that mean, what we've been doing for the last several decades? And if moving forward, people like you and other researchers are now saying, well, before we unleash a new herbicide, fungicide, pesticide on our crops, let's look at them longer in the lab and see what the health effects are. Is there going to be resistance from the industry? I mean, the industry's there to make a living. They're there to make money, make profits. So You know, but what you're saying, it implies that we haven't been using the precautionary principle, or at least not very well up until this point. So do you see that there's, you know, is there pushback from industry?
Well, certainly there are multiple stakeholders in any of these registrations of pesticides. And on one extreme, you have the individuals that want this material to get to the market soon so that it can be used because it will have potential benefits, regardless of, you know, timelines for looking at it and so on. On the other side, you have a group that would like to study thoroughly and look at every contingency. We tend to, in some of the recent examples, wind up too far on the side of being perhaps a little bit hasty in terms of quick fixes, because there's so much pressure to produce more, doing more with less. In other words, getting more yield per acre, whether it's to feed people or animals or what have you. So anytime you have that enormous pressure, you're going to get pressure to stop the science and to move forward with the registration.
So there's pressure to get them out of the market.
Yeah, definitely.
And again, we're talking about crops of corn and soy, which, and we're talking about large-scale crops of corn and soy.
Right.
And I'm assuming, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that a lot of that goes into, aside from the animal feed, it's going into a lot of what we'd call snack food, junk food. A lot of the corn is going to make corn syrup or sugar, fake sugar from corn syrup. And so we're not talking about nutritionally feeding the planet or nutritionally feeding our country. We're talking about making more junk food.
Well, some of it is corn syrup, some of it is feed for livestock, some of it is biofuels. Corn is, as you know, our #1 crop and is used for many, many, many things. So to say, should we move away from corn? Can we grow other things? We could. But I think in the short term, the better target would be corn's not going anywhere. We have entire towns and cities dependent upon corn. Let's try to do a little better. We know what we can do better. We know we can improve.
How can we improve?
Let's do it. Well, for one thing, the example that I just gave of these pesticides that we're using that have no demonstrable benefit. And yet, if you are a farmer and you want to buy corn seed that isn't treated with neonicotinoids, you cannot find it.
You can't find corn that's not treated with...
No. If you're a large-scale corn producer and you want to plant, let's say your elite hybrid, what they call racehorse hybrids, these are strong performers, and you want your GM, you want your BT toxins and Roundup Ready, but you don't want seed treatment, you don't want neonicotinoids in there because you've seen, well, maybe they don't provide yield benefits. You can't buy that. You cannot buy them without neonicotinoids on them. It's not widely available. And in fact, for our research, we had to call multiple seed dealers to find it. It's difficult to find. And that was small research plots. If you're planting hundreds, thousands of acres, it becomes, of course, more difficult.
What about non-GMO corn? Can you find non-GMO corn that's not soaked in neonicotinoids?
So when you say non-GMO, you mean not Roundup Ready and not BT corn, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that, if it's conventional corn, in other words, not organic, it will also have neonicotinoids on it. So everything that is not organic, every kernel will have neonicotinoids on it.
So is there any hope for farmers or for somebody to make supply available to farmers that does not have neonicotinoids, do not have seeds soaked in neonicotinoids?
Oh, certainly. I mean, it comes off the plant that way, right? And so it should be, in theory, very possible to offer untreated seeds. And in fact, the Canadian Seed Trade Association, in response to some of these questions that we're talking about with bees and so forth, and water quality issues, has pledged for 2014 to have the same hybrids that growers want available as treated with neonicotinoids or as not. So they've gone on record as offering that. So it's been done there. It could be done here if there was the will to do so.
And do you think the will to do so is growing?
I think it's growing, but I think it's a long way from a reality. I think the first thing that needs to happen is producers need to know that this material is not a prerequisite for growing a crop. It's far from it. It doesn't show consistent benefits to yield. It doesn't show any consistent benefits that we can measure in terms of insect feeding or crop height or anything.
In terms of Roundup Ready and BT corn, and that is the majority of corn grown in this country. So it's the majority of corn that is eaten, whether directly or via, because you're eating a piece of beef that was fed this corn throughout its life. Knowing what we know now about how, and again, it's not your field, but knowing what we know about how we live very closely with all the bacteria in our gut and what the Roundup Ready, the glyphosate, does to bacteria, how it interferes through the shikimate pathway. Knowing that, how do you personally feel about eating BT and Roundup Ready corn?
Well, I think two things. I think number one, these products should be labeled so that everybody can decide for themselves what they want to eat, what's in their food. Everybody is entitled to know that. But number two, for me in particular, when you talk about BT or Roundup Ready, I don't have a strong opposition to eating foods that are made with those particular hybrids, partly because the alternatives and the other ways of growing corn had some real downsides in terms of chemicals that were used there too. And in comparison with those, the BT and the Roundup Ready are actually, on balance, preferable for the human health aspect, in my opinion.
But given the choice between corn that was raised organically without chemicals added to it or being soaked in neonicotinoids and GMO, BT, or Roundup Ready corn, which would you choose to eat?
For a lot of these things, if the price were the same, I would choose the organic produce. Simply because with organic produce there are many insecticides, pesticides in general, that cannot be used on those crops.
And why wouldn't you want to ingest them?
In a lot of cases, these pesticides are applied prophylactically, and they're applied in the absence of pests. And to ingest these compounds and to be part of the consumer base that ingests them, you facilitate continuing to put them out there with no reason to do so. I mean, we do need some pesticides to grow food, there is no doubt. We do not need these pesticides to grow corn and to grow soybeans. And we should be able to vote with our wallet, so to speak, on those sorts of issues.
You know, it's only your opinion. I know this isn't your field specifically, but I have looked at research and seen rates of illness, specific illnesses, especially in children, going up since we introduced the neonicotinoids specifically, and also even backing up a little bit before that since we introduced the GMOs. Now, we don't know either way definitively, but my question to you is, since moving forward, we don't really know what the health effects are going to be the long term. Doesn't that sound like an experiment?
Yeah, that question I'm not comfortable with because it has so many human health aspects that I'm just not confident on. I haven't read the literature and I don't know.
Theoretically, though, let me ask you, if we unleash something that's going to be used by animals and people on a daily basis, several times a day, if you think about it, right? We don't really know the outcome, 10 years, 20 years.
Right.
From a scientific definition,
right.
Is that not an experiment?
Certainly. We don't know with any of these pesticides, when we release them, how they will behave when they're out in the environment. And our history is littered with examples of, you know, these good intentions in terms of pesticides in general going awry from time to time. And so the minute we think that we've got it figured out, that's when we know that we need to revisit our assumptions and look more closely. Just because of the areas that we're farming on. The scale, the magnitude, the new areas that we're pushing agriculture into. And in many cases we could do things differently, better, by some definitions, but we aren't because there is a knowledge deficit out there in terms of getting to the end users, the producers, the farm producers.
And one more question, because you mentioned this, and I don't know what you think about the research, but if you look at research that has been done, and I'm talking about Seralini's research and some others, where they looked at rats who have been exposed to organic produce versus conventional, but sprayed with Roundup, and then GMO, which has both the Roundup and the animals that were exposed to the third group actually fared worse than the animals exposed to just the pesticide-laden produce.
Yes.
So that takes me back to something you had said, which you said, well, the GMOs theoretically are better than the conventional ones that preceded them because they had less pesticides. They still have lots of Roundup on them, though. They're sprayed heavily with with Roundup. And it's looking like perhaps that we don't really know the long-term effect of that accumulating in us. So again, from a scientific definition, is that not an experiment?
Well, there's a couple things in this question here. These experiments you talk about with the rats and the tumors, there are several large methodological problems with that set of experiments. And we actually read this paper for lab meeting a few months ago, or more than a year ago now. And so drawing conclusions from that paper is going to be shaky and not going to get you very far, because that's just not the way our dietary exposure to these compounds occurs.
In what sense?
Well, the magnitude was too high. The rates were too high. There were no intermediates, as there would be in the processing of corn before we ate it. Those intermediates weren't there in the rat system. In other words, they were eating corn. Here's the corn that was grown. Eat it. We can't eat that corn. We don't eat that corn.
No, but it gets ground, it gets cooked.
Mm-hmm.
Does baking it take out glyphosate?
I don't know.
It doesn't. So I'm not sure how that matters, but my question then would be the reverse. Do we have evidence, do we have a study that used animals in a different way, with corn in a different way, in bigger numbers? Because I've looked at all the research that shows that it's safe.
I don't know.
That's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Can you tell me a little bit specifically about your study with bees?
Right, so this was a study we initiated beginning in 2010, did more in 11 and 12, looking at why we were having reports of dead bees at apiaries in Indiana that coincided with corn planting. So what we wanted to know is, why are these bees dying? What is happening? Is it something connected with corn planting? So we collected dead bees, looked at what was in them and on them in terms of pesticides, and we looked at a wide screen of pesticides, hundreds of different candidates. And what kept coming out was the neonicotinoid pesticides, specifically the ones that are put on corn seed. So that led us to look at, okay, how are we getting corn seed that's being planted in the field? What is the intersection with honeybees? Because they are not interested in cornfields, they're not interested in corn planters. And after testing dandelions and soil and pollen, the contents of hives, the pollen in hives, and the material that comes off of planters, we found that, number one, neonicotinoids were present in all of those. But number two, the material that was coming off these planters was at a very, very high rate of neonicotinoid dust. And that this dust, we think, is the main bad actor in causing these bee deaths in the springtime.
It's very important.
Yeah, and it's something that we can do something about. And what we're hoping for is that we have next year and the year after, we have compounds that we can add, lubricants that we can add that don't cause this massive dust off, that don't abrade the seeds and basically push this material out into the environment where it can go, where the wind carries it or the water carries it and so on. Of course, that doesn't do anything about what you're putting in the field. It doesn't reduce the amount you're putting into the environment, but it contains it. So it's a little step forward, potentially.
And is there pushback? I mean, is anybody denying that these neonics, does the industry who make the neonicotinoids deny that this is contributing to colony collapse or the bee's death?
Well, it depends how you phrase it. So I think it's widely accepted now that some of these spring deaths have been caused by this planter dust and planting, and industry, the registrants, have been part of the effort to reduce that dust. But at the same time, there are claims that there have been no documented effects, no scientific evidence that colony health is affected negatively by neonicotinoids. But that's not true. There are many studies that have, at the colony level, that show negative effects of neonicotinoids, not just lethal effects, but sublethal significant effects, homing failures, reduced rearing of queens, and so forth. There's never going to be a perfect study that satisfies everybody. And every study can be picked apart, and that's what you see happen consistently, is that the shortcomings of various studies are pointed out, and that they're rendered less declarative, they're less unambiguous, because you can point out that not everything was done properly, which no study is perfect, especially with honeybees that are hard to work with.
And who's behind stating that these studies don't really prove like what your study has shown? I mean, is this another independent researcher, or is this industry?
Well, there are lots of papers out there, scientific papers, on this honeybee issue, and especially with respect to neonicotinoids. And most of the field work has shown that there is an effect of neonicotinoids, and sometimes the rates are high, sometimes the rates are low, sometimes the effects are stark, sometimes the effects are very subtle, sometimes there aren't effects. The declarative statements that there is no scientific evidence of colony health, that claim is usually put forward by the registrants themselves.
So the industry? It's not so surprising.
No, it isn't surprising. And again, in the absence of a definitive, perfect study, very tightly controlled, all factors minimized except for this one, you'll always have this. I mean, we've seen this over and over again in history. We never have the smoking gun. We never have the paper we point to and say, there, that solves it. And you never will, because we're talking about hundreds of millions of acres. How can there be one answer that covers hundreds of millions of acres? You'll never have that. It doesn't happen.
So Les, thank you very much for letting me talk to you. I know you're busy. You've been very busy with the campaign in Washington, and you're a physician by training, correct?
Correct.
But I know that your passion of late has really been looking at the research on GMO food, on the effect on health.
Correct.
So I'd like you to tell me what research you're looking at and what you know.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about my background, so give a little bit of a context. I am board certified in internal medicine, fellow of the American College of Physicians, so I was traditionally trained, but my whole 30-year career was focused on prevention, wellness, getting people off of medications, trying to prevent disease rather than treating disease. And prior to about 4 months ago, I used to tell people that GMOs, in my opinion, were the biggest threat to our health that I'd seen in my entire 30-year career. But then Howard Vliger came up to help support our I-522 GMO labeling campaign, and I got to travel with Howard for 2 days. And he's a soil scientist who really specializes in helping people do remediation of their soil and get their soil back if it's been contaminated with genetically modified crops. And he's been involved with soil science for 20 years. So he's just an expert in this area. And Howard had just published with Judy Carman, a veterinarian from Australia, back in June, a journal with an inflammation study, which is profound. And Tony, you being a physician as well, you know that chronic inflammation is the basis of 90% of the disease that we have today. And what Howard had done was he would go around and talk to the veterinarians who are being involved with slaughtering of animals. And all of the veterinarians basically said that it's normal to have a pig's stomach basically looking like this. This is basically what a normal pig study looked like, feeding non-GMO type of a diet. Then the pigs that were fed a GMO diet, this is what their stomachs look like, this red, inflamed, ulcerated type of condition. And the pigs that were fed antibiotics and GMOs had a lighter, pinker stomach, but they still had a lot of ulcerations, so it didn't totally protect. Most animals are fed antibiotics today, which is why we have so much antibiotic resistance. And this was a very startling thing. The other thing is that pigs' intestines and animal intestines, where we make sausage, the sausage casing, the intestines are so raw and friable, we have to import the pig casing from New Zealand because we don't have animals in our country that we can actually make sausage casing from, because again, all the GMO crops are destroying the insides of our farm animals.
I've not ever heard that. That's crazy.
It's, you know, this was an explanation. And so what happens is, it's supposed to be also happening with soy, not just corn, but for instance, BT corn, one of the main crops, basically the insect has been programmed through the genetic modification to basically poke holes in the insect's stomach, therefore the insects will then die. And what's happening is either we're eating the corn, which is basically in everything, or the animals are eating corn. What's happening is they're getting all of this intestinal permeability and this leaky gut type of a syndrome where we take foodstuffs into our body. The foodstuffs then leak out the intestines and the stomach into our body cavity. They're taken back up into our bloodstream. The bloodstream then recognizes this as a foreign material, and it manifests this anti-autoimmune response because it's never been seen. And this could be the basis of why we're having so much autoimmune disease increase in the last 20 years.
So this study was just done on pigs, and it was really just looking at the stomachs.
Correct.
But what they found were ulcerations, and it makes sense based on what we know about the BT corn. How do you think that's impacting people when they're eating it? I mean, what's the bigger picture regarding this? Do we know?
To me, this is why I've been just so inflamed in the last 3 months since I met Howard, is because this literally describes a lot of the chronic disease that we're just seeing in an explository type of manner over the last 20 years. And we have a huge amount of autoimmune disease. We have a lot of gut and inflammatory bowel disease. If we don't have a healthy gut, it affects every aspect of our body, from cancers to autism to brain to everything.
So this is what you're saying, but do we know? I mean, is there data to show this, to support this?
This is what's fascinating. We went over to meet Nancy Swanson, who is a scientist and a retired physicist from the University of Washington, who has impeccable background and skills. And Nancy has been doing some journalism and investigative journalism on her own. And what she has actually found is the scariest thing that I've seen in my entire career. What Dr. Swanson did was she then took a whole variety of chronic diseases, which is why we have concerns about Obamacare and that big, huge healthcare budget. And she started looking at these different diseases, and she looked at the incidence. And what she did was she would look at either the incidence or the prevalence or the deaths. And for instance, she went to the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, and looked at their mortality data. And she just looked at all this data is published, and she had to do some painstaking effort to kind of put some of this data together and tease it apart. Let's look at diabetes. That's a good example. So here you look at the incidence of diabetes, and you can see that prior to 1996, it's basically a flat curve. But in 1996, when the crops were planted, the incidence of diabetes absolutely just took off. And it's staggering. You look at obesity, and we think of people who have diabetes are generally overweight, but the correlation is even different. And you can see with obesity the same type of thing, where the incidence is fairly flat, but then it just takes off in 1996. And obesity is the basis of so many diseases that we see, and I think it's only part of that picture. I think it's only connected with the GI tract and all this intestinal permeability and these gut problems, and people don't, and physicians in general, don't think of it like that. They really just treat obesity as an isolated type of a problem, and the gut is really related to the whole body.
Mm-hmm. And physicians typically don't really look at gut health anyway.
Correct.
I mean, it's really a new thing that it's in the mainstream media right now.
Absolutely.
When it's been, it's always been an issue. So what other diseases have you correlated with the planting of the GMO crops?
Well, let's take a look at the brain. The brain is not an isolated organ that sits on top of our necks. It's basically also very much tied to gut permeability and the intestinal health and our gut flora, probiotics, I mean, a whole bunch of things. And let's look at Alzheimer's. The implications in terms of the expensive drugs that people have to take, the nursing home care is out of sight, long-term disability type of care, or families that have to take care of family members and they can afford or can't afford, or the time off from work to deal with all this stuff. It's all tied to the same situation. And if you look at the graph of Alzheimer's, prior to 1996, the incidence was very flat, and it just absolutely took off. You know, what if GMOs were really the basis and the cause for this huge amount of money and energy expenditure that we emotionally and financially have to put to the side because of dealing with older people? And we're getting there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it would definitely be one of the reasons, right? I mean, there's always been some people with Alzheimer's, so this would be, to see the rise like that.
It's huge. And then
would be a contributing factor.
And absolutely, and senile dementia, same thing. It's profound. But let's go back to the other side of the spectrum and look at autism. Here we have this problem with these younger people. We don't have a lot of explanation behind it. A couple of my key friends are involved with autism research. But again, it's huge. The graph is flat and then takes off.
It really does.
And so if you look at the incredible amount of money, the schooling, the educational, the problems that we have, when you have an autistic child, look at the quality of your life at home, the dynamics, how tight the family is because of all the emotional strife that goes on, the problems with school, having to take time off from work to support the child. It's profound. Same thing, other side of the spectrum with our youth. But yet, if GMOs are basically the cause of this, we're putting Band-Aids on our medical system. You know, Obamacare is not the answer to dealing with medical care. We need to go back and take a look at our food supply. Nutrition is the basis of 85–95% of our chronic disease situation. And we need to basically, get a handle on why are we letting these corporations buy our way and stop stop our having an influence as a population to go on and be healthy like many societies throughout the world. The correlation is so high It doesn't prove that indeed the GMO crops are causing this, but the correlation is so high, you've got to wonder what else is going on. We have a huge amount of environmental toxicity, plastics, a lot of toxins in what we're eating, what we're exposed to in our skin, but this correlation to me dwarfs anything else that I've seen in my 30-year career, and is literally very likely the basis of the chronic disease explosion in the last 20 years.
Well, it certainly gives you reason to take a second look and look closely. And you know, it's interesting because of all the effects on the gut. Now this makes so much sense, because if we are seeing autism related to it and behavioral problems related to it, we know now, especially of late, all the research on gut-brain connection and the flora, the bowel flora being so important for psychological health and neurological health.
Correct.
So have you been involved in the research, or are you just kind of somebody who takes the research and you
I'm working with
educate?
Dr. Swanson just to give her some clinical help with my background, and to make the information a little bit more practical, explain things, and help her do some of this investigation. Her being a scientist, she does impeccable scientific journalism, but from a clinical perspective, explaining what these things mean, and this is important, this is not as important, and help bringing it to life. Oh, Tony, this is a graph that looks at the incidence of the GMO crops when they're first planted. I mean, to the farmers, this is the best thing than sliced bread. They didn't have to do any weed control, and they just took to it. And it had just exponential type of acceptance, and was used, and just dramatically had just a rapid rise in terms of the incidence of the GMO crops that were planted.
And what year was that, 1996?
1996.
Wow, I mean, it's really, that's several-fold higher.
It just took off overnight. To Monsanto, which is a masterful company in terms of trying to figure out how to psychologically get inside the farmers' heads. The farmers were basically had a wide acceptance of the GMO crops, and they started planting this. It spread, and they had no concerns. They had been told that the GMO crops were safe, and on and on. And
they just accepted it blindly.
Absolutely. And even to fast forward 20 years today, we accept it blindly as well. But 3 years earlier, Michael Taylor, who was one of the lead lawyers for Monsanto, had become one of the top positions in the former Bush-Reagan administration. And he basically passed legislation that said that GMO crops are no different than non-GMO crops and never have to be researched. The FDA then turned the investigation of GMO crops over to the biotech companies that were producing these and said, you have to establish a safety mechanism. And so anytime a new crop comes out today, the FDA turns to Monsanto or the other companies and says, is this stuff safe? They say absolutely, and we turn our head. And Michael Taylor today in the Obama administration is the FDA food safety czar. And this revolving door, Tom Vasilsak, who is in the Secretary of Agriculture, all these people have come in and out of Monsanto and these biotech companies.
Thomas.
The revolving door is just permeated every aspect up to Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, all over the place. And there are hundreds of these people in every branch of the government, and it's a masterful plot to take over our food supply, but they literally want to own our food supply, and they don't care what they have to do to stop us in the process.
That is, you know, you're right, it's a masterful plot. I think that's the best way to term it. It is. They're infiltrating, I mean, if this is all true, they're infiltrating top level and maybe even down into these grassroots efforts. You know, I don't know what you can tell me about what happened in Washington in the last, you know, in November 5th, but you guys failed on the initiative.
Well, we lost 51 to 49, which is incredibly close. But a lot of the grassroots people in Washington, as well as there was a huge grassroots coalition in California that were involved with Prop 37, the same thing. They felt people really need to know the health risks and the health dangers of GMOs, that just the right to know, which is the premise of the two campaigns, is not enough information. You really need to know what's the problem. Then if people are educated, then they more would be willing to agree. But the campaigns limited their message to the right to know, and I can't.
So what do you think you could have done, what could have been done differently that maybe would have had a better outcome?
Well, you know, my whole career for 30 years was involved doing a lot of patient education. How do you get inside somebody's head to make them want to look at something, to evaluate it, become more aware, and then want to do something about that lifestyle and make a change? And that's a very difficult process for most of us, myself included. And I've learned from my own mistakes and my own fears to learn how do I interact with other people. If you extrapolate this to the campaign, if people are not aware there's really a problem, why, with everything that's else going on, their kids, their family, their jobs, why are they concerned about this GMO crop stuff? It's not important to them when they've never even heard of GMO crops. So I think the most important thing is really a huge education campaign so people are really aware of how potentially dangerous this stuff is. We have huge amounts of scientific studies in animals. This human correlation data from Dr. Swanson is profound, which really explains a lot of why I've been in practice the last 30 years in terms of the diseases I've had to interact with and take care of patients. So I think it's really critical that we have a multifaceted campaign to make people aware, which will create some fear, and then they'll want to take some action. People do not take action unless they're alarmed.
And so that it reminds me of having a true informed consent, because
Absolutely.
this, while they have the right, or they achieved the right or bought their right to say that there's no difference between GMO food and conventional food, that it's patented.
Correct.
It's patented, so obviously it's not the same. And if it comes with a risk, it's not just having a right to know if it's GMO. You have a right to know if you want to be part of this experiment.
Absolutely.
It's an informed consent.
Absolutely. I mean, our kids' lives are being totally changed today. And it's staggering to think that we have no control and that basically everybody is bought. The decisions are crammed down. I mean, everything is hidden. The research, especially what's happened in the last few months, Monsanto and these other biotech companies who have a huge amount of money and a lot of influence everywhere they go are basically buying their way to control our minds and our food supply. They want to control the seed population. If you think that 90% of the corn, the soy, the sugar, the canola, 90% of the seeds are genetically modified, when are we going to wake up and realize what is happening? People can't afford their health insurance. That's why we had to establish Obamacare. What is going on?
So, and I'm going to ask you what I ask a lot of people I interview. The industry side says, and the people that are pro say that if you question the safety of GMOs, you are really questioning science and you're questioning progress, because GMOs are progress. I mean, this is what the industry says.
Well, there's a lot of things that are said on the press, even up to the presidents. And it's not just this president, the previous president, because people will listen to one little soundbite and they take it as gospel and they don't question it. People don't question authority, so to speak. So when they hear something that's profoundly put out by the biotech companies, they accept it as gospel. They're not going to go and research it. They don't have the backgrounds or even the reason for questioning this type of information.
And what is the FDA, what was the CDC and the FDA and the NIH, what do they say about GMOs and correlation to disease? Are there any public statements or, do we know where they're sitting on this? And I'm just curious.
I can't speak about the NIH and I can't speak about the CDC, but the FDA today basically allows the biotech companies to establish a new genetically modified crop. They then turn to that company and says, is this new crop safe? Monsanto and these biotech companies say absolutely. And therefore they go ahead and approve these crops. You've got Tom Vasilczak, the Secretary of the Agriculture. When you have people like that, and Michael Taylor, who today is the FDA food safety czar in the Obama administration, these people are at the top of policy decision making to try and improve genetically modified salmon. They just rushed in, even with Dr. Huber's incredible information and concern, they absolutely just blasted genetically modified alfalfa and put it on the market. This is because corporations have been buying their way into our decision-making process. There's no decision-making coming from the public. It's not about health, it's all about the companies making money.
So they get labeled as GRAS, basically, right? Generally regarded as safe.
Correct.
And that's their status. And what about academics? I mean, what about the study that was going on at Stanford? And where are the universities on this in terms of nutrition? Are they bought too? What's going on?
Well, since I'm not in academics anymore, which is my decision, but there's a lot of support. I mean, all academic institutions, whether it be in medical school or in just regular colleges, that are financially in grave danger. And when they can get money from the biotech companies to support their chairs and their endowment funds, they'll do anything. Next thing you know, the decisions are being curtailed and made, again, by these biotech companies. It's ability to control our press, our legislation, every aspect of government.
Alex, thank you so much for letting me come and speak with you.
My pleasure.
So I'd like you to start out by telling me who you are, what you do, where you are, and what kind of work you're doing right now.
I'm Chen Shen, Alex Liu. I'm an associate professor in the School of Public Health at Harvard University. And my research interest is looking at how people exposed to pesticides and what would be the health effect as a result of the pesticide exposure.
So specifically, exposure to pesticides, what are the health effects?
Yes.
Okay. But you've been looking at not just the health of humans, right? You've been looking at the health of bees.
Right.
Can you tell me something about that?
Well, that was the issue started in 2007 when I learned from a TV program about a mysterious scenario that happening in Florida in terms of massive amount of honeybee disappear in the wintertime. So at the time, I treat that as another mysterious ecological problem that not necessarily related to pesticide. But once I start researching what related to bee and the health and so on, I realized that pesticide may have something to do with so-called colony collapse disorder. But I waited another 2-3 years, hoping that other bee scientists would tell us exactly why bee disappear and cause a CCD, but never have satisfactory answers. So when I first came here at Harvard University, I had the opportunity to apply for the campus-wide faculty research grant, which is very small amount of money, but I have this very interesting and in a way that very fascinating hypothesis. So I was so determined to make it happen, to make this research happen. So it took me a year to organize everything, to put all the key players in place, and we did it. But I have to say that at the time, the interest is not really just to solving the honeybee colony collapse disorders. I also believe that pesticide that their interest have something to do with human health. But at the time, in terms of human health research for those pesticides called neonicotinoid, is essentially zero. There's no research.
There's no research on, and say that again, neonicotinoids?
Yes.
And they've been used as pesticides for how many years?
So neonicotinoid has not been on the radar screen until bee colony collapse disorder. So that was 2006, 2007. But even before that, neonicotinoid as a group is the most commonly used insecticide in the world, including the United States.
No, is it an insecticide or is it a pesticide?
It's an insecticide.
So it is.
It's an insecticide.
Right. So it's used to ward off insects eating crops as opposed to
Exactly.
weeds.
Exactly.
Interesting. And when did it come into use?
It actually started in the 1990s, but not to the extent until 1998, 1999. So if you look at the pesticide usage history, for example, there's always one dominant group of that being used in different area. So we started from DDT, those organochlorine, and then we phased them out because the Silent Spring book, and then we use organophosphate for almost 30 years. By then, there's abundance of research suggesting organophosphate linking to different type of health outcome. So government took action on organophosphate, and then we move on to pyrethroid, which is another group of insecticides. So it's always kind of in tandem. There's one pesticide used and then phase out, and the other one come in, and so on and so forth. But for some reason, neonicotinoid always under the radar screen, but has been commonly used. So it was kind of like a misconnection. There's a disconnection here that we know that those pesticides has been widely used, but there's no data. And so the question is how government can approve the usage of neonicotinoid without any health effect data.
And how can they?
Well, there is a report made by American Bird Conservancy Actually, if you read the report, you get some sense of how and why government, especially federal government, approve those pesticide use without data, because they think that this is urgently needed. Otherwise, farmer will be left without any pesticide usage.
So it was approved through like an emergency status.
Yeah, and some of the EPA staff, the scientific staff, actually warned EPA that those pesticides actually could be very problematic. But US EPA decided to ignore their own internal recommendation and approve the use of neonicotinoid. And those are stated and documented in that American Bird Conservancy report, which is made public in April 2013.
So do you think it's the neonicotinoids that are causing the colony collapse disorder?
According to our bee research, yes. And the hypothesis that we have back in 2009 was something like, you know, when we talk about genetically modified corn, it's really just adding a bacteria called Bt. And the Bt somehow render the corn plant resistant to the harm of the pesticide that farmers spray when they were still at the seedling stage. Okay, so Bt become a magical bacteria to protect corn plant, and that's part of this whole so-called Bt corn. But farmer has been planting Bt corn for almost 20 years. Guess what? Resistance show up. So none of the Bt corn retain their mojo.
None.
None.
None of the Bt corn.
Right.
None of the GMO corn.
In fact, a lot of professors and extension agent researchers actually warn USDA and EPA that you have to find a solution, otherwise those Bt corn will be useless because the rootworm problem is so severe and they don't get killed. And in part, I think they were somewhat indirectly promoting neonicotinoid use. So going back to the hypothesis that we have in 2009 was that during that time, the company that manufactured Bt corn, which is Monsanto, they need to find alternative. They need to find something else because these things is not going to work, especially in the United States. Bt corn might be still useful in other places that they don't really have a long history of planting Bt corn, but in the United States, they're useless. So they found this wonderful insecticide called neonicotinoid. The reason they can use neonicotinoid because the unique characteristic of the insecticide, which is systemic. So no other insecticide has this systemic property in which that you don't need to spray those pesticides. You just coat the seed with those pesticides when they were still the seed. And then you coat those pesticides onto the surface of the seed or even make them soak it in the concentrated water. And then by the time you plant the corn seed, the pesticide will grow with the plant to every part of the plant.
So it gets incorporated in all the cells.
Exactly. So the residue of the pesticide that used to be in the seed will be translocated to every part of the plant, including corn, including the pollen, including the leaf, and then agglutation come out from the leaf.
And what about including the animal that eats the plant?
That part we don't know. But what happened is that the corn that we harvest from those genetically modified crop are made for something else, right? So one thing that really put the corn in use is so-called high fructose corn syrup. So it's a liquid sugar water. It was predominantly used in beverage industry and other processed food. Somehow, commercial beekeepers start using high fructose corn syrup in late 1990s because they found the honey actually is a very valuable commodity. So they scrap off all the honey at the end of the season, right? But they had to put sugar back to the hive, otherwise the bee has no food during the winter. So they've been using high fructose corn syrup. But it was fine, although some beekeeper questioned about the nutrition content of high fructose corn syrup, but not to the extent that feeding beehive with high fructose corn syrup would kill the whole colony until Monsanto experimented this practice by coating their seed with neonicotinoid. That was 2005, 2006. And guess what? A year later, they wipe out 93–95% of the colony in this country within the commercial beekeeper industry.
So
that was my hypothesis. My hypothesis can be supported by the fact that what's going on in the field. So we went out to get a bucket of clean high fructose corn syrup, which is no neonicotinoid, and then we put some neonicotinoid. In this case, we use imidacloprid, which is the most commonly used neonicotinoid in the world, not just in the United States. So those level of imidacloprid in high fructose corn syrup that we added to does not kill the bee right away, meaning the bee were still healthy during the time that we feed them those contaminated, pesticide contaminated high fructose corn syrup. But guess what? 23 weeks later, the hive that we treated with imidacloprid, they just die one after another. They not only die one after another, the way that they die, the post-mortem observation that we have are consistent to the report of CCD.
no, in the CCD case, in the colony collapse case, they weren't having high fructose corn syrup with the insecticide. They were eating high fructose corn syrup made from corn with the nicotinide.
Right. Right.
With the neonicotinoid.
Right.
So
we basically, the experiment that we did in 2011, 2012, basically mimic what commercial beekeeper has been doing in their own professions. And the only factor that we put it into the experiment is adding those imidacloprid to the high fructose corn syrup. And also we set up a control hive right next to the pesticide hive. And the control hive all survived. And the only one died, but died of the disease that is very different to those CCD hive. So we published the paper and had a huge pushback.
what was the pushback?
Well, the pushback was saying that it's a very small study. Dr. Lu treated the hive way too high. It's not the level to be encountered in the environment, and so on and so forth. And so we actually have a very difficult time to publish that paper in the United States.
Who were you turned down by?
We have been rejected by 4 or 5 different journals. And some of them actually went through the peer review. And the peer reviews comment, as a researcher in my job for almost 16 years, those comments were nowhere close to be constructive, collegial, or positive.
What can you give me an example? I mean,
For example, they criticize the way that we spell honeybee to be one word or 2 words. They challenge the CCD is a global phenomenon. The reviewer said the CCD only limited in the United States, and so on. So that's what I'm saying. It's not only the comment are very, very destructive. It's not actually professional. And when we review a paper, a manuscript, the purpose is to help the author to get the manuscript published, unless it's really, really something that should not be published. So we did it in a way that to support our colleague and get the paper published. But on the other, but for some reason, this bee paper was so suppressed. It seems like there's a gigantic wall built by somebody else that you cannot penetrate. So we decided to publish in another journal in Italy. And we actually have similar comments. But once we addressed the comments, we were able to get the paper accepted and published. And that led to a lot of public attention about whether that pesticide is really the cause. And that paper, fortunately or unfortunately, that we published in Europe, that was included in the European Union's decision to temporarily ban those pesticides for 2 years. So the paper was cited. Our paper was cited in the final documentation that was finally approved by the European Congress, and then they took an action, whereas that paper never been cited by our government in the United States.
And how long ago was that in Europe?
2012.
2012. So it's still under moratorium.
Yeah.
Well, I find that the European Union tends to use more precautionary principle.
Right. So the precautionary principle is actually written in the European Union Constitution.
Oh, no wonder why.
It's their constitution saying that if there is something that cause environmental damage. Although there are variations associated with the finding. As long as the finding is scientifically credible, government need to take action. And that's the major differences between European Union and United States.
And so have we seen colonies come back in Europe? I mean, has there been improvement since they've put a moratorium on the use of
it's too early to say. I think they just started this temporary ban. So I think in 2 years we should know. But I think there's a huge caveat here is that who actually do the tallying, who actually monitoring the status of the colony in Europe. I think there, in my opinion, there's a huge penetration from industry, especially policy like this. So they obviously wanna get the result in favor of their stand, not the government's argument. So I think the policy by taking those neonicotinoids away from the agricultural use for 2 years is a very good policy. But my concern is that if in the process of monitoring the health of the colony in Europe has to be independent, has to be very neutral. Otherwise, the outcome is still not very good.
So the question I have would be that the professional beekeepers, they are only harmed in this, right? I mean, what do the professional beekeepers say? What do the behavioral or the apiary specialists, the bee specialists say about this? Again, the beekeepers can only be harmed if they're losing their colonies. Where are they in this debate?
I think this is a very interesting question. I think the professional beekeepers are very unique in a sense. They are not a big industry, so they kind of help each other. As long as there's one leader making the call, most people will listen to that person, but they don't know exactly who that person is, who actually this person is working for. One of the person that always writing an email to criticize our paper that published actually is a commercial beekeeper.
Really?
Yeah. So when I asked him this question about why you are so object to our finding, in which try to protect your honeybees, and he really have no answer. So if you are a beekeeper and you has been suffering from the CCDs, and then somebody in Boston published a paper saying this could be the reason that you lost so many hives, why you are so object to?
It doesn't make any sense. There might be things going on that we have no idea.
And this person eventually become one of the key person in a company called BeeLogic, which was bought by Monsanto a couple of months ago.
That's your answer, isn't it?
Right.
That's exactly what I was starting to think, is that maybe these beekeepers are getting monetarily reimbursed somehow.
Right. So a lot of commercial beekeepers may agree with what the study finding, but I think they're probably not in the position to express a totally different opinion to the people that run this whole organizations.
So in BeeLogic, does they organize the beekeepers to move the bees around to pollinate?
BeeLogic used to be an independent bee research companies, but just because Monsanto and other pesticide company realized that neonicotinoid is very important to their business and it's being challenged, so they need to have a bee research company so they can, in a way that they're kind of producing the result that they want.
So Alex, what would happen if all the bees were gone? What would happen to our farming culture, our food chain? Do you know?
In fact, I can tell you right now that the bee population as a whole, their health is deteriorating. I think I saw the data showing that in 2010, we only had 50% of the colony left after World War II, meaning that within that 60-year period, in the United States, we lost half of the colony for any reason. That is really alarming because bee is somehow very, very unique in terms of being a pollinator. There's only one pollinator, which is honeybee, that can do such an efficient job pollinating the tree. In other words, if you say we have another 50% colony die this year, the first industry is going to suffer from huge economic loss will be almond in California, because we produce 95% of almond in the world to feed the food. Yeah.
And almond trees.
And almond trees somehow has to be pollinated by bee for two reasons. One, they're massive growth, right? In this small area in the middle of a central valley in California, if you don't have bee, which is millions of bee, right? You cannot accomplish pollination within that short period of a window, which is 10 days to 2 weeks. So that's one thing. The other thing is that at the time, the temperature is still relatively cold. We were talking about early March, right? If you don't have a healthy honeybee colony, they could not go out and work. So that is alarming. And then you think about other places like Washington State, Oregon. They have a lot of tree orchards. We're talking about apples and pears and cherry and so on and so forth. You think about Massachusetts, we have cranberries, right? Blueberries. You think about in Florida, we have citrus industry. Those are heavily dependent upon honeybee pollination. And there's no other natural pollinator can take over honeybee's job.
But is there an artificial way of pollinating that perhaps some of these companies are working on?
Well, it looks like that they are developing these robotic bees, or so-called genetically modified bees. The critical point here is that the honeybee, if there is something going on within honeybee colony that prohibits them from overwinter, then the colony die. So overwinter is a key right now. In our study shows pesticide that harm them in a way, not kill them right away, but
they can't pollinate.
They cannot live through the winter. So usually CCD happen during the winter month or toward the end of winter month, meaning that this colony somehow lost their ability to overwinter. So the key point is what caused their inability of overwintering. Our government research suggests it's all because of the pathogen infestations. But my argument is that if really caused by those pathogens, right, most of the bee would die in the hive. But CCD is not.
They die out of the hive.
You cannot see the dead bee.
Right, they're gone. They just disappear.
Yeah.
Well, and the pathogens have been around always, so what's making them susceptible to
Exactly.
the pathogen? Why suddenly? They've evolved with all these pathogens.
Exactly.
But I have to bring you back to this one point. So the same companies that presumably are contributing or causing this colony collapse disorder are now coming up with drone bees to do the work of bees. So then they would own the world's pollination. I mean, so everything that we know in terms of tree fruits and tree nuts would be owned by them.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. If they make it successful.
So these are not actually bees. They're not insects. They're not live beings. They're robotic, mechanical entities, correct?
Well, if you think about it, they can make bee just like genetically modified corn or genetically modified soybeans. So before we have those GMO, farmers know how to save seeds for next year, right? So now, because of GMO, you couldn't. You have to buy seed from the company every year because they put up this enzyme that kill the vitality of those seeds. Bee is the same thing because the natural bee cannot overwinter. So they probably die out through the winter, right? So they can come up with genetically modified bee. So what? They die out in the winter because next spring you buy bee from me and they will pollinate your crops.
So, and we think they're working on this.
I think they're working on it. I think there are a couple of so-called rumors that, like for example, the almond industry, they collectively develop this kind of bee, which is not genetically modified, but they are not designed to pollinate. But somehow they feel like this is probably our safety. If the bee cannot work, then at least we have this traditional bee that don't really pollinate that efficiently, but at least they have something else. I think there are people testing so-called genetically modified bee, see whether they can pollinate, but die out through the winter, and they can buy it again. Another possibility will be to introduce another species of bee, which is not native to North America, called Africanized Italian bee. Do you know what those are?
Are those the killer bees?
Exactly.
And the problem with them?
Well, there's a couple of problems. One, they are very violent. That's why they call killer bees.
Yeah.
So I don't think they are appropriate for pollination. Second, they cannot withstand the cold winter.
If they're
here.
from Africa.
Right, that's why. So I think that the killer bee can survive in Texas or Arizona, but nothing north of those states. So it might be difficult to bring those killer bee to the north to pollinate almond, for example. They claim that those killer bee are tougher and stronger against pesticides. So that part suits their interest very well. But I think it would be a huge mistake to bring Africanized Italian bee to United States, because I don't even want to think about the consequences. Can you imagine that in our environment, there's always killer bee around?
They go out and sting everybody? I mean, it's...
Yeah. So they're in a way, they're very aggressive.
They're very aggressive.
The Italian bee that we used to have, they actually are very nice ladies. As long as you don't bother them, they don't bother you. If you have the intention to harm their colony, then they will come out and sting you. But if you just leave them alone, they leave you alone. Usually the injury happens not because of honeybee, because of yellow jacket or Africanized Italian bee. Can you imagine that we have those killer bee around? That would be something that I would not want to have in my backyard.
So the other thing brings up the question about honey. If bees, unless it's organic honey, honey that's raised on, created on an organic environment, people are eating honey and the honey must be loaded with the neonicotinoid.
It's a very interesting question. So I think you can call yourself as organic beekeeper, but I don't think you have control in terms of where bee will go, unless you know that within this 3-mile radius, that where the beehive is set up, there's no pesticides. Then I would say that honey from the hive will be likely organic honeys. But once bees fly out to the environment, they can forage whatever they want, right? There's really not much control the beekeeper has in terms of whether my bee only go to the organic field, not go to the conventional. So you're right. Honey could become a good indicator of whether your bee has visited somewhere else that has a pesticide residue, either honey or pollen.
So the other question I have is, there must be some countries, maybe, that have not used the neonicotinoids. And what is the quality of their bee colony? What's the quality of their bee colonies right now? Do we know?
I don't think there is a place that's free of neonicotinoid because, again, neonicotinoid is the most commonly used insecticides. I don't think there is one.
Well, only Europe right now. There's a moratorium for 2 years.
Yeah,
but
hopefully.
Hopefully.
But you know what? The other thing about the neonicotinoid is that they actually behave similar to DDT in terms of their biological half-life. Once you put those neonicotinoid in the environment, say for example, inject it in the soil, and the soil leach out to your groundwater aquifer, their half-life is as long as DDT if you apply those neonicotinoid on a yearly basis.
And does Monsanto make this neonicotinoid as
No.
well? No, it's not Monsanto.
No, Monsanto is not a pesticide manufacturer.
Well, they make Roundup, but that's...
They make Roundup. That's the only one they make.
But not insecticide. So who's making...
A lot of those big players, Bayer Crop Science, Syngenta, BASF, yes.
Okay, so we have these companies making this insecticide that there's evidence now, since we've been using it, the bees have been dying off. And none of the companies did safety studies, and none of the governments insisted on safety studies. Has
No.
neonicotinoids been used in medicine? Had it been used before? Why did all these governments just assume that there were no safety studies needed?
Government ignore the fact that those neonicotinoids are systemic. But the industry used systemic as a clause to support the safety of their product, because they tell government that you don't have to spray neonicotinoid.
Oh, I see.
You inject it to the soil. You put it on the seed, right? So there's really no open air application. There's no crop duster flying over the field and dump those neonicotinoids. So because of that, government said, sure.
So it was never a concern how it would be when it was ingested or bioaccumulated.
Exactly. And pesticides were never being tested in the consumer market in terms of whether there would be a health until the epidemiology results suggest that there is an adverse effect.
And what are the epidemiological, what is the epidemiological results study? Like, what do they imply in terms of, so there's nothing, there's no studies on this. But
there are some animal data, but there's no epidemiology data.
There's none?
None.
Do we know how they affect a body? What do they block? What do neonicotinoids, how do they work in a
system?
So
if you do a toxicological testing, right? So neonicotinoid inhibit a receptor called nicotinic acetylcholinesterase, which is an important receptor that is responsible for your neurological functions, right? But we do know now that pesticide and other chemical as well likely to insert their action other than that specific mechanistic pathway that we know.
So neonicotinoids were not used in World War I or II as nerve gas. This does not come from that.
It's not coming from the organophosphate part of the family. It's actually from the nicotine part.
But there are other nerve toxins that have been used in warfare that work similarly, that work on the acetylcholinesterase.
Right, but it's the organophosphate act on the enzyme itself, but neonicotinoid act on the receptor. Yeah, so it's different.
Wow, it's really scary. It's to imagine a world without bees. I can't even imagine. It seems really sad for me. How does it affect you? I mean, are you a father? Are you a parent? Do you?
If you look at my research and the statement that I put out, the paper that I published, I never call for ban specific pesticide. I actually call for responsible usage. I do believe that there will be a balance that the farmer use pesticides to whatever they want to serve their best interests. But by the time the farmers harvest their crop, there will be very little or none residues. And I would say that would be a perfect scenario. But for neonicotinoid, I do have to say that we need to ban them. They are not supposed to be part of this whole society. What I can say is that we learned from our current study that the harm that neonicotinoid could do, not only to honeybee, but human health as well, is beyond what we know. And that could be a huge public health threat.
I would imagine it could affect cognition and physical movement, because acetylcholine is a very important neurotransmitter.
There are already studies from countries like Japan, for example. They see that neonicotinoid, the level that don't cause any harm that you can measure right away, but affect brain functions, especially brain function in kids, in fetus, in newborns. They've done this in the rodent studies, not human.
But rodent.
Yeah,
and can you tell me what the rodents look like? What could they not learn? Did they have hyperactivity? Did they have anxiety, social anxiety?
So there are markers that you can collect from animals like mice or rats.
Absolutely, they're smart. They're really smart animals.
Right. So I mean, there are actually data from those animal studies suggesting that neonicotinoid could trigger disease like ADHD, autism, those type of neural impairment.
Sure.
If you think about, if those animal studies suggesting those neurodevelopmental hazards, then you can also interpret the way that they could also cause neurodegenerative disease.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so,
because they are on the same spectrum. It depends upon the age of the individuals.
Right, and the stage of development.
Right.
And exactly.
Exactly.
And I know that acetylcholine is very, very important in terms of the whole vegetative or rest and relaxation state.
Think about this statement. I work with two beekeepers. They are not scientific person. They are just experienced beekeepers.
They understand bee behavior.
Oh yeah, they understand more than anybody else. That's why it took me a year to find my collaborators. When I proposed this idea, they were actually quite skeptical about whether Dr. Liu's idea makes sense, all right? I think if you read the Boston Globe article, you kind of get a sense about how they look at me and so on and so forth. And I mean, seriously, before Christmas 2010, they thought that Dr. Liu's experiment failed because nobody died. They were actually fine. And they're about to go on vacation. And right there, we start getting phone call from people that we set a beehive in their backyard. They say, oh, your hive died, one after another, right? Guess what they told me? They said, those bees must be crazy because they are not supposed to go out in the winter. That's their instinct. Just like one hive has only one queen, there's no two queens. That's their instinct. But somehow, in the middle of the winter, which the ground also covered by the snow, those bees willing to go out, and obviously they die because they cannot survive in the winter. So what's going on? And they knew that those hives only treated with pesticide, whereas the control hive sit next to them are fine.
And they didn't go out.
So their first reaction to witness the CCD in our experimental site were, those bees are crazy because they didn't die right away.
And the studies in Japan with the rodents, with
Yeah.
the mice and the rats.
Yeah.
The rats and the mice looked
So they
cognitively impaired.
Right, so they introduced very low level of neonicotinoid, in this case imidacloprid, the same pesticide, the insecticide that we use in our first study, and they see those outcomes. So that prompted us to do another study, year 2 study, which is the data that we are collecting and writing a paper right now. The result actually very, very shocking.
But you're not going to shock me today with it. I would love you to. Can you shock me today with it?
Well,
Or
I just don't know how quickly my paper can be published. But we can come back and talk about this.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's really scary stuff. I mean, one last question. Do you think, well, actually, okay, so one last question regarding the government. The EPA, do they know about your studies? Do they care? You know, have you talked to anybody at the EPA? That's one question. And the other question I'd like you to address would be, you know, have you looked around the country and seen academic centers that should be doing work on this, either that were doing work on this or should be change gears or switch gears and go away from this, or say the contrary? And if so, have you seen ties, you know, have you seen unusual things? Have you seen, you know, BASF or Bayer or Monsanto CFOs or CEOs coming into these academic centers and suddenly becoming part of the academic center? I mean, what have you seen going on
So
that no one else, why isn't anyone else doing this incredible research?
So when we have the data from our first study, I actually wrote a letter to the US EPA Administrator, Lisa Jackson. I sent the same letter to the Director of Office of Pesticide Program to basically tell them the result. I consider that as a very significant outcome because directly we prove pesticides issue. Obviously, Mr. Lisa Jackson resigned from her post. The director of OPP is still there, but he made no mention of that study.
So you heard nothing from them?
Right, exactly.
Amazing.
And I even wrote another letter to him to directly respond to the criticism that made by the Bayer crop industry in terms of...
And you heard nothing?
I heard nothing.
So here you are, associate professor at Harvard in the School of Public
Right.
Health, and you write...
And that's not really broken my heart. The thing that really broke my heart was that EPA decided to host a scientific advisory panel to discuss the pesticide harm to the honeybees. That was the first panel meetings. I have been invited by US EPA to attend that specific panel meeting since 2004. Every time I was invited, I submit my documentation, they approve it, and I physically show up in the meeting and discuss the content and wrote a report. This time I was invited.
You were or wasn't?
I was.
You were, okay.
And then I was de-invited.
You were de-invited?
Yeah.
You were uninvited. Wait, you've been invited every year.
Yeah.
You contact the EPA to let them know that your research shows there's a problem with
Right.
neonicotinoids. and you get invited and then uninvited.
Right.
And what did the invitation say? I don't even know what to call it. It's an uninvitation.
Well, so they basically say that, I mean, he is the person that coordinated the meeting, right? So he called me one day and said, Dr. Lu, unfortunately, I have to tell you that you are de-invited to this panel meeting. And I said, well, I know that you are just coordinating this whole process, but I do really want to know, so what is the reason? Do I have a conflict of interest? Usually it's the conflict of interest that make you de-invited, right? Because you have to submit the paperwork and show, if you own like 1 million share of Monsanto stock, then you couldn't go to the meeting.
Or maybe those are the only people going to the meeting.
But he said that's not really the case. The case is that we found the expertise that you have, meaning they found somebody else that will fill in my seat on the panel. So my question is that who else?
Did you ask?
I didn't, because I know that he's not really the person to make a decision. I don't want to make him feel bad about it. But I thought about this. I said, well, maybe there are some other people that do pesticide research that I can live with that. But pesticide and colony collapse disorder, especially these pesticides, I don't think there's anybody else in this country could do a better job as an independent scientist to discuss this subject at EPA.
Did you have them put it in writing? I'm just curious.
No, they would never put it in writing.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting.
They don't even send me an email. They call me.
Yeah, they don't want any written documentation that they're uninviting
but the response from the OPP was that we found other expertise.
And has this event happened?
It already happened.
Do you know who it was sitting at your...
I didn't know. But there's no other people on the panel could do a better job to discuss this subject than I would do.
And this is the EPA.
This is
this is a governmental agency.
Yeah. So that really broke my heart. That really broke my heart. So that is something that I will never forget.
Something you'll never forget.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think about that? I mean, that's a sad statement.
So something actually very interesting happened at the beginning of May 2013. European Union decided to implement this 2-year ban, right? And 2 days later, US EPA and USDA host a press release of the report. Basically, the report is totally different to the European Union decisions. The report basically said that, we look at these things, which is multifactorial, that cause colony collapse disorders. We're going to spend another 5 to 10 years to study exactly what caused that so we can take a better approach. In the meantime, we're going to implement a couple policies to make sure that we protect honeybee from whatever harm that would be. And none of the things that they state in the report are specific enough that you would believe that honeybee health in this country will be protected. But the worst is that although the press release was co-hosted by USDA and EPA, they said that whatever say in the report does not represent government's position. So who actually wrote the report? That's the question.
Oh, industry. I mean.
Right. So the report is a proceeding from 2 meetings, 1 symposium, 1 workshop, all hosted by the industry.
Well, there's no.
But there's another question, interesting question that we should ask the American people, is that majority of the neonicotinoids are manufactured by European-based company, Syngenta, Bayer Crop Science. They couldn't convince their government their products are safe to honeybees, but somehow they're able to convince our government that their product's safe.
Well, that seems to be the theme in a lot of the things that we're investigating for this movie, is that for some reason, the United States is probably the best government you can buy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what about the other part of my question, which is academia? Have you seen this kind of behavior coming from academic centers?
So one part of academic research, quite obvious, is the agricultural research. So a long time ago, the government actually initiated a very good policy in terms of establishing those land-grant universities, right? So in those land-grant universities, they have this so-called very strong and very active agricultural research, which actually benefit a lot of farmers, right? But over the time, those agrochemical industry understand how they can play this game so they can bring government, which in this case USDA, and farmers together in this extension agents that, if we can sponsor their research, then obviously we can influence their decision, their technology, and so on and so forth. So the GMO is a perfect example why so quickly the GMOs can populate it across the country, just because of endorsement from our USDA, right? And then we apply those technology to the farmers, so farmer can do everything just one stop with Monsanto. And they are replicating this in this whole honeybee scenario, because they believe that if we can bring USDA, in this case EPA too, together with some of the commercial beekeeper, nobody can break this alliance, and we can do whatever we want. So when you look around, when CCD just happened, US Congress actually appropriate a certain amount of money to USDA to do the research.
Oh my.
Okay, people like me has no access to that part of the money. In fact, there are some entomologists in different universities argue that how USDA use those money.
Yeah, be really nice to know.
Right, how they use the money. So my observation was that since 2006, since the CCD story broke, industry quickly formed the alliances and have those people publish paper in the journals, right? So those people form the peer review pool. Right?
So they have control
They
over
have the
what
control.
is being published right
They
now.
have the control. So people that never belong to this fraternity or sororities, that your paper will have a hard time to go through their peer review process. And that's what happened to us. One question that I got from those nasty, harassing email was that, what do you have been in this whole big research? They even criticized that in the paper that we publish, who can claim themselves as a bee researcher?
Yeah, it's amazing. Now, what's going on in other parts of the world in terms of this research?
So European Union actually look at this very seriously, and that's why they have those bans. There's many people, researchers across the European continent, they believe that pesticide is the culprit of this whole CCD issues. Actually, more studies show up right now in the literature in terms of documenting the hazard of those neonicotinoids to honeybee, either acutely or chronically.
What's going on in Asia, in China?
Well, Asia, they still have the problem, but somehow they don't really have the CCD problem, I think, in part because most of the Asian countries are in the much warmer regions.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, winter is a key season.
So you need to have winter. There must be winter to see the colony collapse disorder. That's a key ingredient.
Right. Almost, I can tell you this: a country that has a very obvious winter season, and they also have the neonicotinoid usage. They will have CCD.
So Russia is seeing this problem as well.
Japan has CCD. I never heard of Korea, but Japan has CCD. Their NHK did a CCD documentary about 2-3 years ago. There's 3 hotspots in Japan that always has a CCD problem. So Canada has CCD problem. So it's a global phenomenon for sure, especially country in a colder region.
Mm-hmm. So if it's a warm region, the bees won't die from this neonicotinoid
likely.
because their abnormal behavior will not kill them.
They die not inconsistent to CCD symptoms.
Wow, very serious stuff. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
My name is Dr. Mercola, and I'm a family physician, and I transitioned into a physician journalist, and I founded Mercola.com. So our mission is to educate the public about health issues. Now, I first became fascinated with health after reading Dr. Ken Cooper's book, Aerobics, in 1968. I started running at that time, and I've been exercising ever since. After 42 years of running, however, I realized this wasn't the healthiest approach, so I shifted to a better type of exercise, which is high intensity interval training, which we call peak fitness, and also include strength training and flexibility. I was also interested in nutrition, but my understanding of a healthy diet has radically evolved since I was in medical school. So my commitment and passion has grown to be far more comprehensive than just improving nutrition, as I'm now focused on the threats that actually limit people from applying the information once they know it. So now I focus on the pernicious collusion between the government and the drug and food industries that put roadblocks in the path of people actually applying the information that we teach them. If you travel and you go into a typical hotel or a fitness center, you'll find that the vast majority of people are focusing on cardiovascular exercises. About my experience, about 80% of people. And that's certainly better than sitting on a couch, but the newer research is showing that there's far better exercises for far less investment of time, effort, and energy. So the high-intensity exercise training involves pretty much any type of aerobic activity, but done in a position where you're first warming up, then going out at full maximum intensity for about 30 seconds or so, and then recovering for 90, and then doing cycles of that, and then, of course, a cool down afterwards. And then combining that with strength training, and there's many different varieties of strength training, but I think that's really an important part of a comprehensive exercise program. Well, the evolution that I went through, and actually many other individuals who were confused by what was called the low-fat approach, which was precipitated primarily by Ansel Keys, a researcher in the 50s. So the focus was on lowering your fat content, and there's only 3 primary nutrients that one can use: fat, protein, and carbohydrates. So protein's concentration is going to stay about the same. So if you lower the fat, you're going to increase your carbohydrates, and that can be problematic for many people because it raises insulin resistance and causes many chronic degenerative disease. So for the most part, I realized that I've cut down the carbohydrates and replaced them with healthy fats, not necessarily highly processed vegetable oils like omega-6 fats, but mostly high-quality animal fats that are raised humanely and properly and organically, and not in an industrialized caged animal feeding operation. Well, my diet typically is about 60% high-quality fat, maybe 20% protein and 20% carbohydrate. So a typical breakfast for me would consist of about 2 tablespoons of raw, organic, grass-fed butter that I melt, and then I put that in some dehydrated cucumber pulp, which is left over from my vegetable processing, and then I put in 4 raw eggs, and to that I add half of an avocado. And in addition, which I think is really the last part of the puzzle, is I add about 4 to 6 ounces of fermented vegetables, something like a sauerkraut, which really provides that we actually had this objectively documented, about 10 trillion colony-forming units of beneficial bacteria. So it's a phenomenal way to massively improve your health, because the gut is really the key to optimizing your health. And that's really one of the reasons why sugar is so dangerous, because it negatively influences the good bacteria in your gut. Other types of animal fats that I would use would be, well, coconut oil obviously is not an animal fat, but coconut oil, butter, raw eggs, and then healthy meats. No, in many ways it's very similar to the drug industry. It's a very large corporation that has access to many billions of dollars, which wields enormous influence. But primarily the single most important influence is their ability to effectively lobby Congress and initiate legislation which essentially decimates effective competition. So they are able to set up an industry which works very efficiently, and the analogy to a factory is very appropriate here, because that's what they do. They get a factory farm, and it works great, factories do, for making commodity products that we all benefit from, like an iPad. Thankfully, these processes exist, but when you apply them to food, the model doesn't work, and you just create you can create food that will provide you calories, but there's so many downsides to that that's actually going to have a very, very, very powerful destructive influence on a person's health. The food chain is really challenging, to put it mildly, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist or have an advanced medical degree to understand that. All you have to do is to walk into virtually any grocery store in the country, and you can see that there's, the vast majority of the food that's being offered to America is really highly processed. And the problem is that 90% of the food that Americans consume is processed food, and that's the challenge. So there's specific problems within the industry that lead to this, but it's this consumption of massive amounts of highly processed foods that are really the core of the problem. So really, if you want to get healthy, that one of the primary rules that needs to be followed is that someone has to spend time in the kitchen, whether it's you, a spouse, or someone you hire, and you need to prepare your foods fresh, and you need to have the highest quality possible ingredients. And if you rely on processed foods, you're going to have a significant negative influence and impact on your future health. There is a significant gap. Unfortunately, the industrialization has really started to penetrate into the organic market because these food giants realize that there's enormous amounts of money to be made. Anytime you have a large amounts of revenue to be secured, there's powerful influences that go in to try and seek to change the whole model. And that's what's happening, and there's a real effort to fight that. But the primary difference, if an item is truly organic, is that it is not exposed to pesticides or herbicides. But in addition to that, and this is a really important part of the label, and really what has been decimating the health of the future health of our country, not so much now, but the direction we're going is not, it's not good. And that is this reliance on genetically engineered foods. So not only is the genetic engineering a problem by creating antigens that have never existed before and that can contribute to things like infertility and potentially decimation of the species by not allowing us to reproduce, but also a big portion of the reasons why these seeds are genetically engineered is to provide resistance to very potent and powerful herbicides. The primary one is glyphosate or Roundup, and that is just pervasive in all these foods because they spray it like crazy so these weeds don't grow up, and it's highly contaminated, and it's a very potent systemic influencer of hormones and other complications. So it's not only the antigens from the genetically engineered food, it's the contamination with these potent herbicides. How does it get better? It gets better by giving people the information. And unfortunately, with the biotech industry, primarily Monsanto, who seems to be the leader in this area, there is this powerful and incredible effort to delude the public. They've effectively penetrated virtually every area of the government. And because of that, it's virtually impossible to pass effective legislation to provide the simple basics of letting people know whether or not the food they're purchasing has genetically engineered components or not. They have made very specific and vigorous efforts to prevent people from even becoming aware. So the answer to your question is that we're going to be starting this in California, where we use a legislative process that require the food companies to simply label the food. Once that label goes on a food, most studies have shown that it's going to be the equivalent to a skull and crossbones, because the vast majority of people, well over 70%, some studies show up to 90% of people, will refuse to purchase that food. That's why there's been such a vigorous effort from the food industry giants to prevent this from occurring. And just as in Europe, where essentially most genetically engineered foods are not sold, it wasn't done through a government legislative process. It was done through simply requiring the companies to label, let the consumers make the choice. Because an informed and educated consumer can vote with their pocketbooks. The only thing on the label is simply an identification that this food contains genetically engineered material. That's it. Most Americans believe that drugs actually perform a highly beneficial role, but once you understand health and nutrition, you begin to appreciate that drugs are rarely ever the answer for virtually every health condition, and they occasionally can be used. But the primary reason that one might reach the conclusion is that they're typically watching TV. And since 1995, virtually 15, 16 years ago, it's been legal in the United States, and the United States is only one of 2 countries in the world, that it's legal to advertise prescription drugs. That's an illegal process everywhere else in the world. So you hear these strong motivations and sort of brain manipulation that these are the solutions, but they in no way, shape, or form address the cause of this. Now, these collectively, some of the largest pharmaceutical companies have, I believe, $500 billion of annual revenues. So there's an enormous power and influence that results from that. And they employ some of the most sophisticated and intelligent marketing strategies known to man. And part of this includes phenomenal political lobbying efforts so that they can go in and manipulate the legislation and the law and pass laws, which essentially eliminates the competition, and make it illegal for people to offer simple, inexpensive solutions that truly and authentically treat the cause of the problem. Certainly, an informed parent should be concerned for their kids and their grandkids and essentially all future generations, because if we don't address these important topics, at some point it's going to be too late and the genie's out of the bottle, and you've really catapulted or started a domino process which is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. So the key is going to be to learn more about this information, to question a recommendation by your physician. And of course, I mean, physicians ideally should be tremendous health coaches to help people understand the process of the disease they have and let them know their options and choices. But don't rely on your physician as just as the solid answer to do independent research. Thank God we have the internet, which is really a radical revolution that didn't exist for the most part in the last century. But now you can go to a search engine like Google and type in any question and see a whole variety of different answers. Now, of course, you have to select some wisdom because there's some challenges out there, but it's easy if you spend some time, effort, and energy to sort through those, and you can come to a reasonable conclusion and make an educated guess, and you don't have to rely on the physician like you did 50 years ago, because there wasn't really any other practical way to get that information. One should have a health coach. And so as an educated health professional who has advanced training, and one of the best ways to find that, because you need a coach. I mean, unless you're a health professional yourself, you need a coach. And even then, it's still probably good to have a coach. But the best way to find it, because many people going into this model aren't aware of where these people are, because it's not an area that they're networked in. So it's an easy process to do, is that there's health food stores all over the country, and most communities have a few. And if you just go into them and talk to the people there and discuss your problem and ask who in that community is the expert that they would recommend they see, and eventually you'll reach a consensus, and then you can use that person as an advisor to consider some of the options. And it's important to remember that health is not a static process that we know. It's dynamic and always changing. On our website, we go through 1,000 articles every day to review all the literature that's being published, because we're learning more and more, so that the correct answer, the appropriate answer for any specific person, is highly individualized, but also changes with time. So it's an evolving process. Well, the system is fatally flawed, and we don't have to look too far to realize that, because the United States is rapidly going down economically. We are spending over $2.5, rapidly approaching $3 trillion every year. And I don't think any of us would have a problem spending that much money if we got results, but we don't have very good results. We rank 49th in longevity. We're equally far down the hill for infant mortality. So we're not getting the results for that investment. So eventually we're not going to be able to afford these choices. It's a simple, basic reality. It's a fatally flawed system that eventually, most experts believe, will crash. And then we're going to have to rely on solutions that truly address the foundational causes of the healthcare problems that people are facing. It's unfortunate, in many ways, it's like an alcoholic. Many tend not to get better until they're in the gutter. And I suspect there's a good possibility that our country will have to reach that level of decimation before they really become strongly motivated to find these specific solutions because we're just not going to have the resources to do it. It's been my experience, I've been in this field for about 20 years now, and we see a progressively increasing number of people who are becoming more frustrated with the system. This is largely a result of people dying from the system. Every year, 125,000 people die from properly prescribed prescription drugs. And mistakes, I mean, if you add in all the mistakes that physicians make and hospitals make in drugs, side effects, the medical system is now the #1 cause of death. So if you start impacting hundreds of thousands of people every year, that message starts to spread because you not only affect that person and their relatives, it's their friends and family. So there's this progressive realization that the system is flawed and is challenged. So there, as a result of that, more and more people are beginning to seek out alternatives to the what's been traditionally recommended. Well, tragically, humans are not typically motivated, at least in my experience, it's really a small segment of the population that's motivated to stay healthy without some type of other influence. Even with all the dangers of smoking, we still have 25% of the population smoking cigarettes, and we know about the dangers of tobacco. And so I don't think we should ever outlaw them. I'm a firm believer in freedom of choice. So people have the information, and there are many people, they're going to make choices that are not good for their long-term health because they're focused on the short term rather than the long term. But I think we are reaching a progressive plateau of the potential people who would be interested in making a shift if they knew, if they weren't manipulated and deceived and brainwashed by the powerful marketing influences that has been wielded by the pharmaceutical industry. Well, I think we can look to the tobacco industry for some interesting historical perspective because for many years, the tobacco industry was rigidly denying that smoking caused lung cancer. Despite all the scientific evidence that they specifically resisted that. And many people still smoked. Many healthcare professionals smoked. 80% of nurses smoked. But eventually the information and knowledge became known. And now we've reached a plateau where even though it's all known, there's 25% of people. But there's been this interesting movement within the government, specifically the CDC, to develop this educational campaign where they show fairly significant, horrific complications from end-stage smoking, such as amputations and Berger's disease and emphysema. And while this is frightening when you're in that age group, the people who are 19 and 18 years old, they don't understand that they don't believe it's going to happen to them. And I'm glad to see this happening. It is kind of a surprise considering the tremendous influence that the tobacco industry has on Congress. But it is happening. But you have to compare that. So where are these ads going to be seen and how is that balanced? We have a relatively small amount of marketing dollars being spent on these ads, and we have $10 billion every year that's being spent by the tobacco industry. So it's just simple numbers game. You can have the best educational campaign, but if it's not spread far and wide and it's balanced against $10 billion from the tobacco industry, it really doesn't result in effective change behaviorally. The pharmaceutical companies, as I mentioned earlier, collectively generate revenues of about $500 billion a year, every year. And that can generate enormous influence to the point where they can afford to spend in the United States every year $4 trillion on direct-to-consumer advertising, which is only legal in the United States and one other country in the world. I mean, tobacco industry spends $10 trillion, but it gets better because that $4 trillion is in it. Additionally, they spend 4 times as much, $16 trillion every year, to leverage that money to educate physicians. So they know how to effectively use their revenues to get the maximum bang for the buck. And it gets even better because the average physician doesn't get $10,000. That's what the average amount is. Some physicians get far less, maybe under $1,000, but select physicians who are chairman of departments or on peer-reviewed editorial boards for important medical journals or hold important positions in the government, they might get $250,000 or $500,000. So they know how to use their revenues to purchase influence that really sets policy, not only governmentally, but also what is considered to be the standard of care. And by changing and evolving that standard of care from the very day a medical student goes into medical school as to the time they graduate and they continue practicing, there's this pervasive influence that's generated by very effective marketing skills of the pharmaceutical companies. Drug companies control the entire system because it's a well-documented fact that the drug companies have the largest political lobbying organizations. They're some of the most clever marketers on the planet as they know how to leverage their resources by bribing politicians to give them an unfair advantage in the marketplace and by placing legislation that is absolutely devastating to their competition. And this is typically implemented through federal regulatory agencies like the FDA and the CDC. And most people are under the impression that political corruption only involves somebody handing over a check and getting a favor. That's not the case at all. The foundation of the corruption is really all about bribery that involves giving a gift to somebody who makes a decision on behalf of the public. At the end of the day, that's really what bribery is. The system has never changed and continues to this day because the people who make the reforms are the people in the system that are responsible for changing them. So reform efforts are merely fake efforts to tweak the current corrupted system. For example, the system forbids lobbyists from taking a congressman to lunch for $25, but allows them to take him to a fundraising lunch where they can give him $25,000 and they call it a fundraiser. And they have access to all that same access and all the same interactions with that congressman. So the only solution is to prohibit members of Congress and their staff from ever becoming lobbyists in Washington. So if you make the choice to serve the public with public service, then serve the public, not yourself. Unfortunately, that simply is not going to happen anytime soon. You know, in many industries, and we don't have to look too far, and such as technology, one of my other passions, and the most profitable and wealthiest company on the planet is Apple Computers nowadays. It's the #1. And it's applauded for its innovation. Unfortunately, the same innovative tendencies does not extend to the health field. And this is largely, not exclusively, but largely a result of the pervasive collusion between the government and the drug companies. They have wheeled about $500 billion of annual revenues, and this is able to essentially manipulate the system. So as a result, if they perceive a threat to their revenues, and they have very clever and sophisticated models to predict these threats, something that would essentially be a radical breakthrough, such as a treatment for cancer that really is effective and works, they will identify this threat very early on and use federal regulatory agencies like the FDA and maybe even the CDC, but primarily federal regulatory agencies, to shut that operation down. And they'll come in after them with guns to shut them down and close their operation to essentially strip them of all their revenues. So however significant the threat is really determines how much effort and energy is directed towards squashing that threat. And certainly, you know, the ability to practice medicine is a state-granted privilege. It's a license to practice, and that license can be revoked. So part of the process is to essentially establish standard of care through this very sophisticated and clever system of influencing the trendsetters by essentially bribing them. And once that standard of care is set, then these local medical boards can go in and reprimand a local physician's license who doesn't follow the standard of care, and they can legally do this and essentially quiet them. And then, of course, there's this social condition where an individual, a physician who may be aware of some alternatives, is going to be highly reluctant to participate in that because he's going to be looked at as unusual or weird. So there's a social pressure to follow that in addition to the local medical boards and authorities. So these local medical boards, if they reprimand a physician's license, or even worse, take their license away, then their very ability to earn a livelihood is obliterated or severely impaired. So as a result, I mean, many healthcare professionals have enormous loans out, and they have responsibilities, and they don't have a lot of extra revenues to fall back on. So there's this fear that gets generated, a very real fear that motivates them to follow the standard line. The whole medical system is designed to essentially create barriers to competition. And they do this in a number of ways. They have professional organizations like the American Medical Association, which is essentially a trade organization, which can facilitate passing regulations and rules which essentially limit their competition. And they can even go so far as to whole professions, such as chiropractors, and establish, threaten them and establish legislation which essentially limits their ability to function and practice freely. Fortunately, the truth eventually comes to the surface, and lawsuits can be filed. They're very expensive to do, but they can be filed, and those actions can be corrected. I'm doing this out of passion, and I would recommend anyone pursue whatever their passion is, because then you know you're going to be successful. So I'm beyond passionate about this topic. So one of the side effects of that is that I get to apply this information to myself personally. So as a result, I just hardly ever get sick, and I know I'm going to live a long time. So I have many, many years in front of me to work on my mission, and my mission is to catalyze the change in the United States that will essentially educate people, to let them know that there are alternative approaches, that they don't have to rely on dangerous drugs and surgeries that could potentially kill them.
I hope you enjoyed this bonus episode of GMOs Revealed. And as a quick heads up, you can still support the mission and own GMOs Revealed for 50% off of the normal price. I have to say, this has been one heck of a journey, and I can't tell you the level of gratitude I have that you took this journey with me. This issue is a huge issue. I believe that this whole GMO scenario is the biggest environmental catastrophe in the history of humankind. And I want to highlight that we have shown individual people, even stay-at-home moms, who have taken action and have activated millions of people to create awareness around this issue that is so sorely needed. Here we are, human beings on planet Earth, and we have a conscience. And we also have a responsibility. We have a stewardship that we live on this earth and we leave it to those behind us. And this whole scenario surrounding GMOs, you've seen the journey, you've seen the interviews, you've seen the experts, you now understand what's going on. Knowledge is power, but if you just sit with the knowledge and don't do anything, nothing changes. So let's not only have the power of the knowledge, but let's have the transformation of the action that should follow that knowledge. We work tirelessly on this project because the stakes are high, and we have a deep feeling of spirit and gratitude for the community that has emerged out of this GMOs Revealed project, and that's you. So let's you and I together make a difference in this world so we can lay our head on a pillow at night and think about the fact that we're living our life in a way that's making a difference. Thanks so much for taking this journey with me.